seen most, and she's going to tell us about it.
It's a pleasure to be here. It's really interesting, you know, as Tom said, we met, seems like a lifetime ago, because I now have an 8.5-year-old daughter, and that was before she was even in the picture. So it seems like ages, and I actually live right down the road here now too in Louisville, so that's kind of funny. But as Tom said, I'm actually a biometrics and electronic identity kind of market analyst, if you will, focused on biometrics and things like e-passports and national IDs and automated border control and all sorts of technologies that are wrapped around identity that have been using biometrics. And this topic is interesting to me because in September, a colleague of mine from Toronto and I ran a workshop in Tampa called the Biometrics Unplugged, which is all about biometrics and mobility. And Michael Barrett, who was the ex-CISO of PayPal and who is now the head of something called the FIDO Alliance, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit, used this image in his presentation. He was talking about biometrics and passwords and so on. So I kind of stole some of that from Michael. I thought it was, when Tom asked me about this, I was like, oh, I have the perfect image to start the presentation. Okay, so the password is dead. Well, or at least it's on life support. I think it's hard to say that it's dead because we all use them today as much as we hate them. And we're going to be using them in transition for a while, but they are definitely on life support. They are going. They're really, really going. So I'm going to talk kind of in 4 buckets tonight. And the first bucket is the passport really dead? And it really is dead. It's just going to take a while before it will rest in peace and we can really build a grave and throw it away. And as most things, even as Tom was talking about with CES, with technology, it's, you know, you don't have these drop dead dates. You have processes. You have this vision of imagining the world in a different way. And then you have to say, okay, here's where we are today. Now, how are we going to get there? And the how we're going to get there is always much tougher than envisioning what it could be like. And then I'm going to talk a little bit, my expertise really is in market dynamics and market analysis and what how markets work and what factors impact market evolution and what that means for folks in the technology game. So I'm going to talk about what I call tipping point market dynamics, which are the things really that have finally gotten to the point where the conversation about passwords dying and being dead has moved beyond IT security people trying to scare everybody and into the realm of becoming impossible problems that every single person is dealing with in their daily life. And then I want to talk a little bit about this. I don't know if you guys have seen these or had these, the iPhone 5Ss. I obviously had to have one because I'm in the business. I was anxious to get my hands on it, and I have to say that I have turned off the fingerprint scanning, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And then sort of, what I think the future is going to look like and some ideas maybe about how we're going to get there. So a little bit about me. I have a company called Acuity Market Intelligence, and I have been, since 2001, focused in this area, as I said, of biometrics and identity and that sort of thing. And I do a lot of work with a lot of companies, and what's so interesting for me about being here tonight is my business is overseas. My business is in the East Coast, my business is on the West Coast. I don't do business here. It's funny, I don't have business connections here. It's all internet and phone. So as I said, I do a lot of work with a lot of big organizations, but really don't have any kind of a professional footprint for my company in Colorado. So it was fun, again, to have the opportunity to be here. So is the password really dead? The password's been pronounced dead a lot, right? How many times? It's been going on for more than a decade, right? So what's different now? What's different now is that you now have a secret that can ruin your life. 10 years ago, that was not the case. You might argue 5 years ago it might not have even been the case. Now it is. There's a great quote I found online from this writer from Wired who said that this summer, this was in 2012, hackers destroyed his entire digital life in an hour. Erased his phone, erased his computer, erased his whatever. He got completely hacked and lost everything. his whole personal, his digital life, which is really a personal life now, right? Because we all have 10,000 pictures somewhere, and we have all of the contacts, all the people we know. I was having a conversation the other day with someone about business cards, and I said, I don't know if I'm going to reprint my business cards. Do I really need to have a business card? Do I want to walk around with pieces of paper that I'm handing out to people? So it really is different. And what's interesting about that difference is that what's driving that difference is, if you will, is the fact that it is now not, as I said earlier, not just the IT guys screaming about the dangers of these systems, but it's about people experiencing this on a daily basis. Now, one of the things that I think is really interesting about what happened in 2013, which is, I think, game-changing in a way, is the FIDO Alliance came into being. I don't know if you're familiar. Anybody familiar with the FIDO Alliance? Okay, FIDO Alliance. FIDO stands for Fast Identity Online. It was founded by Michael Barrett, who was the CISO of PayPal, and another one of his colleagues in Silicon Valley. And these guys sat down and they said, this is it. This password thing has got to stop. And we're going to do something about it. And I lived and worked in Silicon Valley for a long time, and I think a lot of progress happens because people in Silicon Valley sit down and say, okay, this is a problem, it has to be solved, and we are now going to take responsibility for solving it. What's interesting about FIDO's birth, if you will, coming from the experience of Michael Barrett, was when he was CISO at PayPal, he had 1,000 people working for him managing passwords. They had 100 million accounts, and it required 1,000 people. So he looked at this and said, this is not sustainable, because I'm PayPal, I don't want just 100 million accounts, I want 500 million accounts, I want 1 billion accounts. Okay, if I'm going to have to incrementally increase the number of people I have managing passwords, it's not a sustainable business model. It was literally, eating money off of their bottom line. And so that's a very different approach to the problem than someone saying, oh, you have these security issues, and it's abstractly not sustainable. For him, it became actually tangibly not sustainable. And these guys had this mission that they're going to change the nature of authentication by creating an open standard that supplants reliance on passwords. Now, they're interested in biometrics, but they're interested in other methods too, tokens and I guess when you start talking about replacing passwords, talking about, one-time password generators is sort of a funny thing. But, essentially they're talking about biometrics and other technologies that replace the idea of us having a single password or multiple passwords for an account. And what's interesting is they went public, if you will. They became a public entity in February of 2013, and by October they had 50 members. And we're not talking about little companies. We're talking about Google and Microsoft and Discover and MasterCard. I mean, these are big players in the industry right now, in an industry that is becoming stifled because of passwords, and it's highly related to mobility, because as transactions move to our mobile devices, it becomes more and more of a critical issue. So you see mobile players. I mean, there's a long list of companies, but it's a very interesting organization, and the growth is just outstanding. I mean, it's just amazing that it happened this quickly. Come on. Okay. So some other, I was just pulling some data out just to take a look at things. Verizon has the biggest database in the world of data breaches. They track this stuff like nobody else. And basically they're saying 76% of them are because of bad passwords. Google came out, and this is all, this is just happening now, right, 2013. Google came out and said, if you're a tech startup and you're planning to secure your data with passwords, forget it, you're not going to be in business. Like, if you're starting now, don't even consider passwords as an option. And that basically they said that they're gone. Google is now actively engaged in alternatives because they have just decided as a corporation they're not going to do that. And there's a big difference between people in the world talking about, okay, this technology doesn't work anymore, this process doesn't work, and big industry-leading technology companies saying, we now are moving to something else. we're going to make that transition. It's very easy to, again, talk about it in the abstract. It's very different when you're saying, okay, now we're going to do something about it. As a biometric analyst, I used to talk to my, I talk to my clients all the time, and they're talking about trying to do access control and all these things, and I'm like, so are all the doors in your building biometrically controlled? Is every computer within your enterprise managed with biometrics? And they're saying no. I'm like, you can't possibly go out and sell this stuff to other people if you're not using it internally. So when you start seeing this stuff happening inside, that's a big change. The US government has this NSTEC initiative, which is basically to create a platform for trusted identification in cyberspace. It's gotten so out of control. It started in 2011. There's good intentions. It is such a behemoth. And while I think it's important because it demonstrates that there's a commitment on the government level, that they recognize that this is a problem, it's an issue, that the government has a vested interest in making sure that people can transact online securely. I think when you go back to the FIDO jumping in, it's like there's this intent and there's this recognition, and then there's a bunch of smart people in Silicon Valley that say, okay, we got to get something done, and they go and do it. And so that to me that's why it's so different, and that's why I think, yes, passwords are really, on their deathbed, let's say. Come on. This just doesn't want to work. Is that it? Yes, that is it. Okay, so tipping points. As I said earlier, my real interest and expertise is in strategic market development. And so I always like to draw pictures and make models and try to, create some kind of a visual representation, diagram, if you will. And this is a very rough kind of diagram. But I think it gives you an idea of sort of what's happening and what has happened to all of us pretty quickly. I have a Hotmail email account because I've had it since 1998, and I tell people it's the most stable thing in my life because I've had this email address forever. And when I had that first email address, that was like my email address. That was it. That was what I logged into. That was what I had a password for. And I recently, this year, I was telling someone earlier, 10 years ago, I had some financial trouble and I had to file for personal bankruptcy, when you could still do that and not lose everything that you had. And I never worried about identity theft. I'm like, no one's going to steal my identity. They'll go look at my credit report and forget it. They might try to steal my information, but they're going to throw it away because it's not useful to anyone. They can't do anything with it. They can't apply for a credit card or a loan or a mortgage or anything else. So, now that I've recovered from that, I finally sat down this year. I said, okay, I have to now do something about the fact that I have all of my bank accounts and all of my retail accounts and all of my service providers online. I'm interacting with them all the time. I'm using the same password. Here I am in this business, right? I'm using the same username and the same password for 37 accounts on the internet. So what do I have now? I have a spreadsheet sitting on my desk with everything. And I took a couple of words that I used in different convoluted patterns and changed them around, and that's my security system. And I'm thinking, this is a problem, and that's the problem coming home. 10 years ago, when the IT people were saying, oh, passwords are so insecure, everyone was going, who cares, whatever, I've got 5 of them or 10, whatever, I can remember them all, it's not a big deal. Okay, research generally shows us that the typical human being can manage about 7 things in their head at once. Like you can easily handle the memorization around 7 things. But when you start having 10, 15, 20. I know people with, I must have like 50 accounts online. There is no way I can keep that in my head. And I have it so secure. I have the file, the spreadsheet that has this stuff in my computer, right? Very safe. And the title of the spreadsheet is dog care, because I think I'm fooling someone, right? Like they're not going to go look for that. But the point is, so this is now a problem that everybody has. So just for grins, how many people in the room have more than 5 passwords? Just keep your hands up, okay? How about 10? 15? We're losing a few. 20? All right, so that's crazy. And you can do this in any room, anywhere, and we're not even talking, okay, this is a sophisticated group, you're technology people, but I could ask my 80-year-old mother, and she'd be up in the 15 range. And that's really when it becomes a problem. So the other thing that's really interesting about this is, it's, as I said earlier, it's no longer just the IT guys screaming that passwords aren't secure. It's financial institutions, it's the government, it's consumers, it's enterprises, it's Target. So Target now is up to 110 million accounts that may have been compromised. They said there was, they came out and said 40 million, everyone was aghast, and now they're quietly after that saying that it could be another 70 million. I'm a happy Target customer. I love Target. I have a Target card. So Target sent me a nice email. Don't worry about it. We're going to provide you with a year's worth of credit monitoring for free. Just, we don't think there's a problem. I called up my bank, whatever, but okay. So let's say it costs Target $100 a head to do that. I don't know what credit monitoring costs, and I'm sure Target gets a deal if they, get it for 100 million people. But if it's $100 a year, that's an $11 billion hit to Target's bottom line next year. Who the hell can afford that? Even Target, they can't afford, right? It's gotten to the point where the problem is just so big, and that's what I mean about tipping point. It's like human beings do not change until the pain of remaining the same is greater than the pain of changing. And we are at that point with passwords, and that's why, though they're not dead today because we're all using them, they're on that path. So there was a picture here. And it was an embedded Excel file, which is probably why it didn't come through. And if you can imagine this picture that was up there, what it was a picture of, what it was showing was the it was there momentarily. It was it? It was. Did it flash and then go away? Okay. So if I go back, will it come up? No. No, that's not it. That's a different picture. So the picture was showing what's happening with the volume of mobile phone growth globally. And what it's showing is the increasing percent of smartphones of overall phone usage. And so it's showing that, you go out the next couple years, basically, 60, 70, 80, the vast majority of phones are going to be smartphones. And the reason why that's important is because we all know that smartphones are not just phones, they're basically our mobile computing platform. Not only are they our mobile computing platform, they are going to be the key touch point for emerging financial management and transaction ecosystems. That is the way. It's also going to be true for identity. It's going to be your passport and everything else, but that's another talk. So this device is going to be the main way that we interact to complete all kinds of transactions, information transactions. I'm checking my bank account. I'm transferring money. I want to pay my mortgage. I've got to check my stocks. I want to, all that stuff, right? This is all, it's all moving toward the phone. And so we have this untethered future where we have this platform that is basically becoming ubiquitous, at least in the developed world, because there's still about 2 billion phones out there right now that are dumb phones because they're out building a parallel infrastructure in the developing world where, they're doing all this stuff by texting. But so anyway, so that's actually, it's changing the dynamics because it's creating this platform that then can be used to do all of these things, which then means we have to have 7 million more passwords. But really what it means is we got to get rid of them. So here's another nice chart. This I also stole from Michael Barrett. Or I shouldn't say that. Michael Barrett probably got it from the FIDO Alliance. There's a woman there named Suzanne who does their marketing. I'm sure she did it. The notion, we have this traditional notion of security, that it is this continuum, right? The better the security, the worse the experience, right? We make passwords better and they're like a nightmare. You got to write them down, then it's. So the idea is, and this is FIDO's belief system, which is you can have both better usability and higher security, right? That better authentication experience is possible. But it means we have to get away from using passwords, right? If you try to do it with passwords don't work in this model, but other kinds of technology will. Forget that. Here we go. So this brings me to my iPhone 5S, which I think is an amazing thing. I happen to, Apple bought a company called Authentic. Authentic has been in the biometrics industry for years. They were leaders in sensor development. And what was interesting about Authentic, and what was different about Authentic than the rest of the biometrics industry that was primarily focused on high security, government-related applications where you absolutely, positively could not have what they call a false accept. In other words, someone picks up my phone and puts their finger down. There's a fingerprint sensor on this phone, you haven't seen it. And miraculously, it thinks they're me. That's a false accept. It's falsely accepting another person. And the majority of the biometrics industry was completely focused on that because they were looking at government applications and high security applications. You know, like if you're going to put your biometrics on a sensor and then have access to nuclear codes, yeah, you know, a false accept does not work. You're better off rejecting someone, even if it's the right person. You're better off inconveniencing the right person than allowing the wrong person to get through. But Authentic did something very different, and this goes to the whole, sort of pulls the biometrics into this whole conversation. Authentic was very focused on consumer devices, consumer biometrics. Authentic understood that when it comes to a personal device, a consumer device, that the risk of a false reject, in other words, the risk of me picking up my phone and putting my finger down and it's saying, no, you're not Maxine Most, is far higher than the 1 in 10,000 risk, or now Apple is saying 1 in 50,000 risk on this sensor, that somebody could pick it up and actually put their fingerprint down and it would accept them. So Authentic was this company that built sensors, and that's how they built their sensors. They built their sensors for personal devices. They built their sensors so that when someone picked up their device, it would recognize them. Apple bought Authentic. Now there's people that believe Apple bought Authentic so that Apple's competitors couldn't buy them. I don't think Apple would have bought them if they weren't interested in the technology. And I happen to know the lead engineer who designed their first sensor, who had left Authentic, came back during the Apple negotiations and now works for Apple. And so they integrated a fingerprint sensor into the button. And what's amazing about this is that what it's saying is, okay, now we have a brand new way of authenticating people. You don't need a password. You have a platform that's going to go out to millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people. You're basically embracing the biometrics industry, whereas the biometrics industry, I said earlier, used to be a scary industry. Well, not when it's on your iPhone, it's not scary, because Apple doesn't make scary technology. Apple makes friendly technology. Apple, you know, it's funny, because I was speaking at a conference back in 2011, and it was on the future of biometrics, and we were talking about mobility, and I said, you know, this was sort of out of the blue. I said, you know, if anyone's going to figure out how to make biometrics work for consumers, it's going to be Apple. Because that's what Apple does. Apple takes technology and makes it usable for people. So what this has done is it's opened the consumer door, if you will, to expanding biometrics in a number of ways. Now, as I said, I was gravely disappointed with this device because I enrolled myself, and I know how to enroll myself, and I'm highly motivated to do it properly, and I know there's all kinds of tricks and stuff, and I know how to do that because I've been around this stuff for years. And I still found that about 30% of the time I had to use multiple authentications to get the phone to turn on, and then about 30 or 40% of the time I had to type in my code. So what did I do? I turned it off. So now I have no security on my phone again. But I have this really cool device. So, you know, it's...
Wait till the 6S.
Well, the reality is that this, you know, it turns out, honestly, I'm a good market analyst because I've always had problems enrolling in all biometric devices. Fingerprints, when I signed up for Clear at the airport, same kind of thing. It's very hard. For some reason, I have difficulty with my fingerprints. I've had issues with my iris. I've learned how to do iris. I have little eyes. I have to like open my eyes. But you know, that doesn't diminish the value of the integration of this technology into this device, because this is the future. And what Fido is doing, and what's interesting is because Apple's always proprietary, so Fido's off working with the Android platform, they're not working with this yet. But what they believe is that they can build standards that will allow this sort of technology to proliferate, that if they can build a standard interface so that any biometric vendor or any token vendor, or anybody who's got an alternative to a password can interface with that technology within a device like this, then that opens the door to really, once and for all, letting the passwords rest in peace. Obviously we're not there yet. I mean, what I want is to be able to pick this thing up and just have it recognize me. I don't care how I pick it up. I don't want to have to, what I call do nothing biometric. I just want to pick up the phone and then, okay, it knows it's me. However I do that. And Apple recently actually filed some interesting patents for that sort of technology. That's what they're really trying to do. They're trying to make this whole thing a sensor in a way. And that's really the future of this sort of technology, because at the end of the day, what we're really looking for is not just to get rid of passwords, which is great, right? That's sort of the stumbling block. That's the obstacle that's in front of our face. The vision is to have a seamless experience, right? The vision is that I pick up my phone and it recognizes me. We're not there yet. I think that's a good 10 years out, honestly. I think there's going to be a lot of trial and error before we get there. I think the first step is we're going to have multiple biometric offerings on standard platforms. Samsung and LG are going to be coming out integrating biometrics. They've been using biometrics in Asia for some time reasonably effectively. The next thing that's also going to happen is that I'm going to be able to look at this thing, it'll do facial recognition, or it'll do iris recognition. It'll use any number of biometrics to identify me. That's what I want next, right? Because the fingerprint sensor is not working that well for me. And the truth is, with biometrics, that's not that uncommon. Both from an actual biological, okay, there's something about my fingers, or maybe it's the dry climate or whatever it is, or just something weird about the way I do it. And for most people, that happens. There's certain biometrics that just seem to work better for different people. So you want to have a range of these things so you're not limiting yourself. And also, when you're also dealing with people with disabilities and other issues, then you really need to have a range of biometrics. So I think really what we're going to have is we're going to start seeing that come out. We're going to have multi-factor authentication enhancing passwords. That's going to be kind of the next step, right? I mean, this thing, even if you do go through the biometric enrollment, you still have to have a 4-digit passcode, right? So you haven't really solved the problem. In that respect, biometrics is supposed to be a convenience factor on this phone, which it clearly wasn't for me. But that's the direction we're moving. And then we're going to move towards this do-nothing biometrics, which is, to some extent that I can pick it up and, it's more passive than my actually having to say, okay, I'm doing this process to authenticate myself. And eventually, we're going to live in this world where we sort of have seamless authentication. And whether that's, the camera on my phone, checking my iris every 3 minutes while I'm working online to make sure that I'm still the same person I was 3 minutes ago when I logged on, to, cameras like that or devices like that where we pick things up or we move into spaces, and there's a token in my phone that triggers a authentication process with another device that then goes and authenticates me, right? There's a whole realm of this stuff that's going to happen, and it is happening now in bits and pieces, but like anything else, right? It's a progression, and the integration, I mean, in a way, the integration of biometrics onto the iPhone, I think, is a huge step in that direction, because it's really sort of, as I said to my friends in the biometrics industry, it's like Apple giving you a big wet kiss. They're embracing you. And so that's huge, because biometrics traditionally has not been that kind of business. And what's interesting also is what you're seeing now is more consumer-oriented, Silicon Valley-oriented companies getting into the biometrics business. And that changes it too, because again, biometrics traditionally has been an industry that hasn't been focused on human factors. They've been focused on high security, military, government, civil applications, where you can force people to do things. And so that dynamic is also changing in terms of what's going to be possible. So the long-term future, anything is possible. And the notion, the seamless experience of biometrics, it's going to be so integrated into our lives that we won't even know it's there. And it will be taken for granted. And it will be happening in a way that is, provides security, does what a password should be doing on, on multiple levels and much more. And I also think that along those lines, the other thing that's, obviously there's a lot of technology development that goes along with this, but I think one of the other big pieces when you're talking about this sort of technology is, regulation, legal frameworks, privacy. There's a whole lot of other things when you go back and look at that progression of what's going to happen in terms of capabilities, right? There's layers of other pieces that have to go along with that. And I think in many ways, those may be even more complex problems to solve than the technology problems, which they often are. Yeah, this is like this new, these different kind of form factors for technologies that they're, it's like a slap bracelet, which seems totally bizarre until you look at some of the stuff that was at CES. I remember when CES used to be like heavy-duty gamers, in these rooms where they would be hooked on video machines, and then, televisions, stereos, telephones, stuff like that. This is to me, I haven't been there in a long time, and it was mind-blowing just to see that.
The gamers, yeah.
Oh, they're still there, right? Yeah. I was there with the guy. I was there, and there was a guy who was in his 40s who basically had a heart attack. He'd been standing playing this game for so long, he had a heart attack, which is kind of sad. It's very sad. So anyway, that's all I had. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer questions.
I've got to think that if whatever you use, whether it's your finger or iris or retina or dental records, whatever it is, that since they're not sending the finger to somebody, they have to send some data that represents that. And if I can hack and snip that line and figure out whatever that is, once I've got that, I've got your fingerprint, I can change my password with an algorithm.
It doesn't work that way. You know why?
How does it?
Well, because if you ever have an exact duplicate, it's not a biometric. Biometrics are threshold measurements. It's not a one. It's not like a password. It's not a 1 or 0. It's a threshold measurement, and so there's. Well, there's all kind. Look, the reality is, but it's not that, and I'm not an expert on this sort of thing.
I'm not either. It's not a loaded question.
Right, no, I know, but I do know that, there's the difference between, let's do a couple levels. First of all, there's different levels of authentication. There's me authenticating myself to my device, and for a lot of transactions, that's all I'm going to need to do. For other transactions, you're then going to need to send information about that device, so the device is verified, and then my identifier is verified, right? There's going to be applications where I'm going to have to take my phone, and then I'm going to have to do a live enrollment at the time to actually do something, right? So there's going to be sort of layers of risk-based authentication methodologies. Now, it's certainly true that no matter what you come up with and no matter what you encrypt, there's always somebody who's fighting it. There's always somebody who's trying to hack into it. And it's kind of a constant battle. But the people that I know that have spent a lot of years really working on the technology have a high degree of confidence that the level of security that you're going to get with the biometric is much higher, and you can't really steal somebody's biometric. It's not like stealing a password. It isn't the same sort of thing, because whatever you get some algorithmic representation of an image that was captured on a device. So there's a couple of stages of capture
an
and
algorithm. Just a stupid simple one that it takes today's date and time and down to the second and puts it with that. If you don't know where that is, and you just don't know the map.
Right. There's a lot of levels. It's not impossible,
Sure.
but there's a lot of levels of complexity.
Quite an algorithm.
It's like, when this thing was announced, it took 2 days to a bunch of guys in Europe to break it with they manufactured a fake fingerprint, right? They didn't tell you that it's about $100,000 worth of equipment to do it. And then you have to ask yourself, who's going to spend $100,000 breaking into one device?
I don't know if I get the $1 billion jewels by doing this.
But you know what I'm saying? It's like, it doesn't scale. It's not a scalable attack,
Yeah, that's a good point.
right? Here's the thing. First of all, these applications we're talking about are not centralized databases. These are one-to-one on a localized storage, okay? There are applications that are large-scale databases. Generally, what happens is that information is not stored with any other information. So you have a database of biometrics, okay? So what am I doing with that? Because it isn't any good to me unless I have it linked back to an identity somewhere else. So there's a lot of levels of complexity built into how these applications are structured, and depending on whether you're doing what is called a one-to-one authentication, like one-to-one, I'm just authenticating myself to my phone, versus a one-to-many authentication, whereas, okay, I have to have a database. Here's an example. In the EU, they have a huge database of asylum seekers, because what happens is people go from country to country in the EU, they keep applying for asylum. They don't get it somewhere, they go to the next country, right? So they developed a centralized database in the EU. Anybody who applies for asylum goes in the database. So you know what goes in the database? Their fingerprint. That's it. So the only thing you're doing when you put your hand down on the scanner and they take it and they match you against a centralized database is telling you, are you in the database or are you not in the database, period. So there's lots of different ways that you can use biometrics that are actually privacy enhancing. Because if you tried to do that with a centralized database any other way, it would require you taking massive amounts of personally identifiable information. This way, you're totally protecting people's privacy. Are you in or you're out? Okay, that's it, that's all we know. So it really, it really depends on how you're configuring these things, and the industry needs smart people. The biometrics industry has been very sort of incestuous, and it comes from forensics. It doesn't come from sort of the IT space. The IT space has been glommed on top of it. And as I said, what's happening now is you're seeing people from Silicon Valley get into it, and from other areas, and they're bringing broader IT expertise that really has been lacking. What we really need to do is marry the best security we have with people that really understand biometrics and come up with, stronger ways to secure the data. But there are huge concerns, you know what I mean? There definitely are concerns. If you're talking about building large databases with personal information and biometrics in them, I don't know anybody in the industry who thinks that's a good idea.
Let me answer this question. Back in 2003 at the Future Money Summit that we did, we had a company there that was talking about fingerprint payment systems. And shortly after that event, we started seeing the fingerprint payment system show up in King Superstores, and then all of a sudden they were all gone again. Can you tell us what happened?
Nothing to do with the biometrics. This is a classic example of what happens with biometric implementations. They fail because it has nothing to do with the biometrics. That was a problem with the CEO of that company, who turned out to be basically a sociopath. He was a real scam artist, and he had scammed his way into getting all this money from investors and everything else. Turns out he was like a criminal. He had a record. He had domestic abuses charged against him in another state. It was crazy. It was like this guy had convinced. I often say this, between that company, Pay by Touch, and the original version of Clear, which, as I said at the time, napkin math could have told you was not a viable business. Investment bankers got suckered into spending $500 million on two companies. One that was run by a diagnosable sociopath, and the other that didn't have a chance in hell of being successful. Had nothing to do with the biometrics. And unfortunately, there's been a lot of that in the industry. So I think what you're going to see, especially now with this Target thing, retailers are going to be begging for this stuff. Because should I spend $11 billion a year buying credit monitoring services for my customers, or should I deploy biometrics at the point of sale and make it easier for people to buy stuff? And the other thing that's interesting about this too is the EU has done a lot of work on this because they're very involved in data protection and privacy to far greater extent than we are, much more strict laws. So one of the sort of principles is you only share as much information for any transaction as you need to complete that transaction. When I go spend money at Target, do they need my phone number or my home address, do they need my bank account number? No. All they need to know is that they're going to get paid. So if you can actually create biometric systems that allow you to have such confidence in the linking of the identity with the credential, right? Or the identity with the resources, then you don't need to share all that information with all these people. They just know they're going to get paid and they don't need all the rest of it. I mean, that's, it's one of the reasons, like, I actually use PayPal a lot to pay for things. Because when I use PayPal, my personal information is not going to these organizations. I mean, some of them are collecting it anyway for other purposes, like not having something shipped to me. But they don't have access to my financial information. They just know that PayPal has said, yes, we're going to pay you. So I think you have to start thinking creatively about that. Questions? Yes?
As the 3D printing continues to evolve and it becomes scalable, is that going to be using biometrics?
As what becomes?
3D printing.
3D printing? Is 3D printing going to make biometrics sustainable? Wow. I have no idea. Because a lot, like for example, these sensors that they put in these phones are actually reading stuff that's under the skin. So there's technology now that's doing vein patterns. There's a lot of things that in terms of biometrics that are being developed that are that would not be subject to.
So are you asking? Taking a finger.
Yeah, you can't. Yeah, you're not gonna. You can't. You can't spoof it. He's like saying, can you spoof it? Can you stick your finger in there and spoof it and get the fingerprint? But the readers are, some of the readers are reading subdermal. It really depends. And your iris pattern is a pattern. It's not a three-dimensional thing. It's a 2D pattern.
It's an actual living finger, biological structure.
See, this is scary. Biometrics used to be scary. Now you guys are making me think it's not scary at all.
That was in essence the question I wanted to ask, is what other types of biometrics are there besides the common ones that we tend to discuss? And also, are there other algorithmic systems that would be superior to biometrics that we haven't yet discussed?
Well, I don't know.
But within the realm of biometrics.
I mean, there are people working on gait recognition, like the way somebody walks. Like when you see someone far away, you can tell who they are by the way they're walking. So there's something in that. There are people who are looking at heart rate and other things that you could, internal processes that you could read with a sensor, like a biomedical sensor. There's people who are looking at all kinds of things. I mean, ultimately, when you think about biometrics, really what you're talking about is a pretty sophisticated pattern matching algorithm. It's pattern recognition and matching. So, I mean, you could take a piece of your side of your face and look at your skin, right? Right. And then they ultimately talk about doing it with DNA, which to me is a little bit scary. But we're pretty, they're increasing the processing of DNA, to the point where it's almost real time, like it's a couple hours or it's 20 minutes, they're actually working on this stuff now. And there's a big controversy within the community whether DNA is a biometric or isn't a biometric, and how that should be treated. So, it gets complex. This is what I was at a trade show several years, 8 years ago, 6 years ago. So they were trying to sell door locks with fingerprint scanners. I'm like, okay, I live in Colorado. Okay, first of all, it's cold. Second of all, I think my daughter was 2 at the time. I said, I'm walking in the house with a baby and groceries. I don't want to put my finger on anything. I want the door to see me and open, right? So it's the same thing with your computer. Everybody's got a camera on their computer. You should be able to sit down at your computer, and the computer should be able to facial recognition, iris recognition, and say, okay, it's Bob. Here's Bob's computer setup. Here's Bob's now logged into everything Bob needs to be logged into. And every 30 seconds or a minute or whatever it takes, depending on what level of security I require, it just grabs it again and says, is this still the same person? There's also a lot of work now on, quote, liveness detection. So they're building capabilities into the algorithms so that they can actually determine whether it's a picture of somebody or really their face, or if it's a picture of someone's iris or their fingerprint. I mean, there's people looking at using pulse as a biometric. There's all kinds of things, right? It really, you know, it's very fingerprint heavy because that's sort of the history of biometrics from the forensic standpoint. And that's really, you know, what we have traditionally used to identify criminals, and that's where a lot of the stuff came out of. Well, the idea is for some transactions, my authenticating myself to my phone and my phone sending a message to that system that says, yes, this is Maxine Most, is going to be okay for a certain level of risk-based transactions. When the risk gets higher, it may want my biometric and it may want to, I don't know, send me back a code to my phone, right? Okay. Or when the risk gets higher, it may actually want to send a biometric, encrypted biometric template if it's, you know, across the network to verify that. Or in some cases, like I said, I mean, your passport's going to be in here someday. I'm going to walk up and, okay, here's my passport. Now I'm going to put my biometric down. I'm going to do a live verification with my device. So you have to think about it as a matrix. And if you go to my website, there's actually, I did a webinar in November that talked about mobility and biometrics. And I built this matrix of applications and the way the biometrics would be used, depending on sort of the risk and the value of the transaction. So it's really, it's not a single solution, it's a matrix of solutions.
Your whole biometrics and identity will eventually just be on the cloud, where you walk down the street and the stores will recognize you and try to beckon you into the store by name.
I hope not. I don't want, you know, I mean, the idea is that, and if you look at what's happening with this whole movement towards person-centric identity, the idea is that you would have control of your identity.
Of course.
And then you would release or not release that information as you wanted on an ongoing basis. You know, yeah, maybe I give it to Macy's and I get really annoyed at Macy's and say, forget it, take it back, right? And in that case, the actual service providers are not going to have your biometric data. The idea is to separate, right, the biometric data as an authentication device from whatever other information they have.
Well, that's where it gets the law has not caught up.
Exactly.
And it's a long ways from it,
Yep.
because right now, if you're in public, anybody can take a picture of you.
Right.
And if you can take a picture, you can take a picture with such detail that you can get their retina and their facial
It's not the retina. Don't say retina.
And
Retina doesn't exist. It's iris. It's a pet peeve. I read all these articles, like in reputable publications, they say retina. There's no retina. There's no commercial retina. It's gone. It's all iris recognition. It's a pet peeve. It's just like people, if you're going to write an article about something, you should actually like figure it out. I mean, we're talking the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg and The Economist and places like that where, you know, so anyway. So yeah, well, this is what I said. The policy and the legal framework for implementing these type of solutions are going to be far more complicated than solving the technology problems. Anyway, so thank you so much.